K2, nicknamed the Savage Mountain. There are very few peaks more famous than this 8,611 meter death trap. The second highest mountain on Earth, but much more dangerous than Everest. A challenge that only the brave and most determined would even think about attempting. The weather is notoriously rough for climbers, consistently causing avalanches that obstruct paths, leaving hidden crevasses layered throughout the mountain, waiting for someone to step into its trap. Mistakes on any mountain can be deadly, but on K2, they are particularly costly. In 1986, Renato Casarotto, one of the strongest Italian climbers from his time, would soon learn the dangers that K2 holds. This is his story. Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel where we cover all tragic and terror stories. So if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, plus ring the notification bell to be notified of all new uploads. And as always, viewer discretion is advised. K2 still stands as the only 8,000 meter peak that has not been climbed on its eastern face. Almost all summit attempts have to be done in summer months, with the first winter summit being accomplished just last year in 2021. Casarotto would attempt to summit K2 from the south-southwest spur route, a very challenging route compared to others, and if he was successful, it would mean he would be the first to summit following this path. You see, Casarotto was no stranger to discovering or climbing partially rough routes to summit mountains. Looking back at his career, one would almost say he relished the opportunity. No, he welcomed and seeked the opportunity. He brought a style of mountain climbing not too popular at the time, but one that is legendary. Casarotto rushed to conquer the 8,000ers in alpine style, light and without oxygen. In a film about Casarotto called Solo di Cordata, he is described as repeating or opening routes on great walls, often in the cold season, refusing radio connections, external support, or other equipment to be deposited along the route. He had chosen total isolation, favoring prolonged stays on the walls, regardless of the cold, the blizzards, and other very real dangers. Through alpinism, he was able to dive deep within his human conditions, pushing his limits until he would find the key to overcome them. Casarotto would open routes on the north wall of Roscaron, untouched northeasterner pillar of Fitzroy, and completed an extraordinary ascent on the north ridge of Broad Peak. Additionally, in 1982, 4 years before he would travel to K2, Casarotto spent 15 days on the 3 Monts route of Mont Blanc in the dead of winter, spanning multiple days in a blizzard, pushing his body to its limits and then beyond, overcoming fear and insecurity, finding the ability to continue through sheer determination. He was a pioneer in discovering what the human body was capable of. These are just a few of his accomplishments, and I can go on and on. It is safe to say that in 1980s, there were few better climbers in the world. But even with all these accomplishments, Casarotto still was left feeling like he was missing something. A crown jewel of all of his achievements, if you will, which he decided would be his summit of the Savage Mountain. Casarotto planned to follow a route that was attempted by a French expedition in 1979, but failed to reach the summit. If he was successful, it would mean he had just opened up a new route to reach the summit of K2. The route is called the South-Southwest Spur, very similar to the Magic Line route that would be successfully summited in the same year as Casarotto's attempts, but there would be a slight variation to the right once he reached the upper part. However, being the person Casarotto was, he planned to attempt this beast of a mountain solo, meaning he would be up there alone with nobody to help. Because the climb could span over a week, one is subjected to the harsh conditions for a longer period of time, greatly increasing the bodily risk. Which also means the longer one spends on the mountain, the more time one is susceptible to the common risks that K2 can produce. In the summer of 1986, he arrived at K2 with his wife, determined to open a new route to the summit. The preparation began sometime in June, with Casarotto's wife remaining at base camp to support from below. For the most part, his attempts to summit remained consistent with how Casarotto expected. The weather and temperatures were harsh. He was very acclimated with this environment, so on June 23rd, the first summit attempt would begin. Casarotto managed to make it past the 8,200 meter mark, only 400 meters from the summit, but had to turn around due to the harsh conditions he was experiencing. It is said that the weather had increasingly gotten worse, and for safety reasons, Casarotto would abandon the attempt. Although the first attempt failed, Casarotto was not dismayed. In fact, it only appeared to fuel his desire to conquer the majestic mountain. Without leaving the site, another attempt was planned, and on July 5th, Casarotto would again reach the same location as before, right around the 8,200 meter mark. But like last time, Casarotto was forced to abandon his attempt as well. It seemed like the mountain was howling at him, telling him something, pleading for him to listen. But the thought of abandoning the summit attempt did not cross his mind. He was infected with summit fever. One did not become the climber that Casarotto was by stopping when things got impossible. No, they broke through the barrier and made the task possible, forging new paths. So on July 16th, Casarotto for the third time attempted to summit. Despite the harsh conditions, he managed to reach a higher point on this attempt at 8,300 meters. Now only just 300 meters from the summit. But just like the last two attempts, the weather turned for the worse and made conditions too harsh to continue. Casarotto was an expert at knowing his limits and prioritizing safety. His life was not worth reaching the summit. But it was hard not to feel a little discouraged. This was his third attempt, and although he had managed to get so close by himself, it was still not what Casarotto desired to accomplish. There was no doubt in his mind. He would continue his attempts to reach the summit. Under freezing temperatures and violent winds, Casarotto descended down after his attempt, making it all the way to the foot of the mountain where the Di Felipe Glacier was located. The most technical aspects of the climb were behind him, and the weather was improving, so Casarotto began to relax. Only an hour left to make it back to base camp, where he would be greeted with the sight of his wife. But Casarotto did not realize that because of the storm, a snow bridge on the Di Felipe Glacier had become unstable. Back at base camp, Casarotto's descent was being observed by a famous Austrian mountaineer named Kurt Damberger. It was about this time that Casarotto would take a fatal step onto an unsecured snow bridge and fall into a crevasse. Kurt watched with horror as one moment he could spot a climber descending, and another moment he was gone. 1 second, Casarotto was walking on the snow bridge on top of the Di Felipe Glacier, and the next he was falling. His body was thrown violently against the ice, and he slid deeper and deeper before being brought to a stop. He had just fallen 40 meters down, stuck with walls surrounding him. Being as experienced as he was, he knew immediately what had happened. He was stuck deep in a crevasse, any climber's worst nightmare. Casarotto was an expert on his body and what it could handle, but even this situation felt dire to him. His body was in immense pain. He could barely move and surely could not make it out of this hellhole alone. After a minute or two, Casarotto was able to maneuver his body just enough to access his rucksack. In doing so, he found what he was looking for, his radio. He calmly turned on the device and managed to call out for help despite his pain, praying that someone was listening. Kurt could not believe his eyes. He was watching a climber descend K2 and was near the base when he suddenly vanished. The feeling of dread sat in his stomach as he took a minute to gather his thoughts. Kurt anxiously waited for a sign, any sign that the climber was okay. But as he waited, there was nothing. It was in this moment of waiting that Kurt remembered his radio. Quickly, he turned it on and heard a voice. It was Casarotto calling for help. Kurt could not believe it, but he was alive and conscious. Remembering Casarotto's wife, Greta, he rushed to where she was located and quickly explained the situation. As soon as she heard what happened, Casarotto's wife leapt into action. Greta called out for her husband over the radio. In a very low, muffled voice, almost like he was whispering, she heard, "Greta, I am dying in a crevasse near base camp." The sun was setting, but the entire base camp jumped into action. A search party was formed, which consisted Italian, British, and German climbers, including some doctors. Because Casarotto's descent was being monitored, they knew immediately where to begin searching. It was not long before the teams discovered where he was located, but getting him out alive would be a grueling and demanding process, one that now had to be accomplished in the dark. Hour after hour continued as they tried different approaches. Each man knew that with every passing second, Casarotto's chances of survival were lower and lower. Through this entire process, he remained conscious and would attempt to help the rescuers when he could. Eventually, the teams managed to move Casarotto to the surface. Relieved to be finally out of the crevasse, he attempted to take a step, but immediately collapsed to the ground. He was in a lot of pain, but thought it was manageable. However, his body was running on adrenaline and was in much worse shape than originally thought. Even though he was conscious, it quickly became apparent that Casarotto was dying. The doctors that were on site tended to his needs, but not much could be done, as most of his injuries were internal. The teams were nervous to begin moving him, as his condition was worsening by the minute, but all teams ferociously worked to improve his condition, but with little to no avail. It was just too late. The fall had damaged his internal organs badly. Shortly after he was raised to the surface, he died of internal bleeding. Nobody had to say a word. Every man there felt his presence. It was a huge blow to the entire mountaineering community. It honestly feels surreal. How can he be gone? Casarotto lived his life to the fullest, not backing down from any challenge. Everyone that knew him there almost expected him to grit his teeth and raise his head, but it was not to be. Following the wishes of his wife, Renato Casarotto would be laid to rest in the same crevasse that took his life. After 17 years, his remains would re-emerge in August of 2003. It was at this time that his body would be transported to the Gilkay Memorial, and in 2005, a plaque was donated by the CAI of Arzenano. He was beloved by his community, praised for his feats. Nobody could describe Casarotto better than his own words. Taken from a letter on the same day of his death, he would state, "The route is tremendously difficult and has tested me to the limit. It is one of the hardest routes in the Himalayas and the Karakoram. I hope to be the first to climb it." Nobody could deny the greatness that he embodied. His determination never wavered, even until his dying breath. There are very few climbers that uncovered new routes, overcame impossible challenges, and just overall enjoyed mountaineering as a whole. This story is dedicated to his legacy left behind and for all those brave enough to follow the pathways he defined.